Our second tale tonight is The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. Reading this is David Gurney. David works extensively in film, and his theatre credits include work with playing Shakespeare with Candlefire Theatre and adaptations of Sherlock Holmes with Free Range Productions. David works also as a voiceover artist and is a regular on the radio. And if he's kitted out with spectacular special effects, he is, we shall go on. The Kit Bag.
When the words, "not guilty," sounded through the courtroom that dark December afternoon, Johnson, the leader for the triumphant defense, carried the verdict across to his chambers like lightning. "It's what we expected, I think," said Johnson to his senior colleague Arthur Wilbraham without emotion. "And, personally, I'm glad the case is over." There was no particular sign of pleasure that his defense of John Turk, the murderer, on a plea of insanity had been successful. For no doubt he felt, as everybody who had watched the case felt, that no man had ever been better deserving of the gallows. "I'm glad," said Johnson. He had sat in court for 10 days, watching the face of the man who had carried out with callous detail one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders of recent years. The counsel glanced up at his secretary. They were more than employer and employed. For family and other reasons, they were friends. "Ah, I remember, yes," he said with a kind smile. "And you want to get away for Christmas? You're going to skate and ski in the Alps, aren't you? If I was your age, I'd come with you." Johnson laughed shortly. He was a young man of 26, with delicate features like a girl's. "I can catch the morning boat now," he said. "But that's not the reason I'm glad the trial is over. I'm glad it's over because I've seen the last of that man's dreadful face. It positively haunted me. The white skin with the black hair brushed low over the forehead is a thing I shall never forget. And the description of the way that the dismembered body was packed with lime into that—" "Don't dwell on it, my dear fellow," interrupted the other. "Don't think about it. Such pictures have a trick of coming back when one least wants them." He paused for a moment. "Now go," he added presently, "and enjoy your holiday, and don't break your neck skiing." Johnson shook hands and took his leave. At the door, he turned suddenly. "I knew there was something I wanted to ask you," he said. "Would you mind lending me one of your kit bags? It's too late to get one tonight, and I leave in the morning before the shops are open." "Oh, of course. I'll send Henry over with it to your room. You shall have it the moment I get back." "Well, I promise to take great care of it," said Johnson gratefully, delighted to think that within 30 hours he would be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. The thought of that criminal court was like an evil dream in his mind. He dined at his club and went on to Bloomsbury, where he occupied the top floor in one of those old gaunt houses in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below his own was vacant and unfurnished, and below that were other lodgers who he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. The night was even more cheerless. It was miserable, and few people were about. A cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets before the keenest eastern wind he had ever felt. It howled dismally among the big, gloomy houses of the great squares, and when he reached his rooms, he heard it whistling and shouting over the black roofs beyond the windows. In the hall, he met his landlady, shading a candle from the draught with her thin hand. "This come by from a man from Mr. Wilbraham, sir." She pointed to what was evidently the kit bag, and Johnson thanked her and took it upstairs with him. "I shall be going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks," he said. "I'll leave an address for letters." "And I hope you'll have a Merry Christmas, sir," she said, in a raucous, wheezy voice that suggested spirits, "and better weather than this." "I hope so too," replied the lodger, shuddering a little as the wind went roaring down the streets outside. When he got upstairs, he heard the sleet volleying against the window panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of coffee, and then set about putting a few things in order for his absence. And now I must pack, such as my packing is, he laughed to himself, and set to work at once. He liked packing, for it brought the snow mountains so vividly before him and made him forget the unpleasant scenes of the past 10 days. His friend had lent him the very thing, a stout canvas kit bag, sack-shaped, with holes round the neck for the brass bar and padlock. It was a bit shapeless, true, and not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited, and there was no need to pack carefully. He shoved in his waterproof coat, his fur cap and gloves, his skates and climbing boots, his sweaters, snow boots and ear caps, and then on top of these he piled his wooden shirts and underwear, his thick socks, puttees and knickerbockers. The dress suit came next, in case the hotel people dressed for dinner, and then, thinking of the best way to pack his white shirts, he paused for a moment to reflect. That's the worst of these kit bags, he mused vaguely, standing in the center of the sitting room where he had come to fetch some string. It was after 10 o'clock. A furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him up, and he thought with pity of the poor Londoners whose Christmas would be spent in such a climate, while he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine and dancing in the evening with rosy-cheeked girls. That reminded him he must put in his dancing pumps and evening socks. He crossed over from his sitting room to the cupboard on the landing where he kept his linen. And as he did so, he heard someone coming softly up the stairs. He stood still on the moment to listen on the landing. It was Mrs. Monk's step, he thought. She must be coming up with the last post. But then the steps ceased suddenly, and he heard no more. They were at least 2 flights down, and he came to the conclusion they were too heavy to be those of his bibulous landlady. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger who had mistaken his floor. He went into his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts as best he could. The kit bag was by this time 2/3 full and stood upright on its own base like a sack of flour. For the first time, he noticed that it was old and dirty, the canvas faded and worn, and that it had obviously been subjected to some rather rough treatment. It was not a very nice bag to have sent him, certainly not a new one or one that his friend valued. He gave the matter a passing thought and went on with his packing. Once or twice, however, he caught himself wondering who it could have been wandering down below, for Mrs. Monks had not come up with letters, and the floor was empty and unfurnished. From time to time, moreover, he was almost certain he heard a soft tread of someone padding about over the bare boards, cautiously, stealthily, as silently as possible. And further, that the sounds had lately been coming distinctly nearer. For the first time in his life, he began to feel a little creepy. Then, as though to emphasize this feeling, an odd thing happened. As he left the bedroom, having just packed his white shirt, he noticed that the top of the kit bag lopped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance to a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock looked just like eyes. A shadow, or was it a travel stain, looked like hair. It gave him rather a turn, for it was so absurdly, so outrageously like the face of John Turk, the murderer. He laughed and went into the front room where the light was stronger. That horrid case has got on my mind, he thought. I shall be glad of a change of scene and air. In the sitting room, however, he was not pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize that it was much closer than before, as well as unmistakably real. And this time he got up and went out to see who it could be creeping on the upper staircase at so late an hour. But the sound ceased. There was no one visible on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the empty rooms of the unoccupied suite. There was not a stick of furniture large enough to hide a dog. Then he called over the banisters to Mrs. Monks, but there was no answer, and his voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house and was lost in the roar of the gale that howled outside. Everyone was in bed and asleep. Everyone except himself, and the owner of this soft and stealthy tread. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been wind after all, although it seemed so very real and close, I thought. He went back to his packing. It was by this time getting close to midnight. With something of a start, Johnson suddenly recognized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous. Also that for some time past, the causes of this feeling had been gathering slowly in his mind, but that he had only just reached the point where he was forced to acknowledge them. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though he were doing something that was strongly objected to by another person, moreover, who had some right to object. It was a most disturbing and disagreeable feeling, not unlike the persistent promptings of conscience, almost, in fact, as if he were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. "Pure nerves, I suppose," he said with a forced laugh. "Mountain air will cure all that. Ah," he added, still speaking to himself, "and that reminds me, my snow glasses." He was standing by the door of his bedroom during this brief soliloquy, and as he passed quickly to the sitting room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the distinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs a few feet from the top. It was someone in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters, the face peering up towards the landing. And at the same moment he heard a shuffling footstep. The person who had been creeping about below all this time had at last come up to his own floor. Who in the world could it be? What in the name of heaven did he want? Johnson caught his breath sharply and stood stock still. Then after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs, he saw to his utter amazement, were empty. There was no one. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes, he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated about the top of the staircase where he had seen the figure, and then he walked fast, almost ran, in fact, into the light of the front room. But hardly had he passed inside the doorway when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into his bedroom. It was a heavy, but at the same time stealthy footstep, the tread of somebody who did not wish to be heard. It was at this precise moment that the nervousness he had hitherto experienced leaped the boundary line and entered the state of fear, almost of acute, unreasoning fear. Johnson's position was an unenviable one. "By Jove, that was someone on the stairs then," he muttered, his flesh crawling all over. "And whoever it was has now gone into my bedroom." His delicate, pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to think or to do. Then he realized intuitively that delay only set a premium upon fear. He crossed the landing boldly and went straight into the other room where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. "Who's there? Is that you, Mrs. Monks?" he called aloud as he went, and heard the first half of his words echo down the empty stairs, while the second half fell dead against the curtains in a room that apparently held no other figure than his own. "Who's there?" he called again, in a voice unnecessarily loud and that only just held firm. What do you want here?" The curtains swayed very slightly, and as he saw it, he felt as if his heart had almost missed a beat, yet he dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window streaming with rain was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but rows of clothes hanging motionless, and under the bed there was no sign of anyone hiding. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and as he did so, something all but tripped him up. Turning with a sudden spring of alarm, he saw the kit bag. Odd, he thought. That's not where I left it. A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bath. He did not remember having moved it. It was very curious. What in the world was the matter with everything? Were all his senses gone queer? A terrific gust of wind tore at the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass with the force of a small gunshot, and then fled away, howling dismally over the waste of the roofs. A sudden vision of the Channel the next morning rose in his mind and recalled him sharply to realities. "There's no one here at any rate, that's quite clear," he exclaimed aloud. Yet at the time he uttered them, he knew perfectly well that his words were not true and that he did not believe them himself. He felt exactly as though someone was hiding close about him, watching all his movements, trying to hinder his packing in some way. "And two of my senses," he added, keeping up the pretense, "have played me the most absurd tricks. The steps I heard and the figure that I saw were both entirely imaginary." He went back to the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and sat down before it to think. What impressed him more than anything else was the fact that the kit bag was no longer where he'd left it at. It had been dragged nearer to the door. And it was here, just when he desired to keep his mind and thoughts controlled, that the vivid pictures received day after day in the courtroom of the Old Bailey came strongly to light and developed themselves in the darkness of his inner vision. Unpleasant, haunting memories have a way of coming to life again just when the mind least desires them. And so now, in the same way, Johnson saw nothing but the dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, lowering at him from every corner of his mental field of vision. The white skin, the evil eyes, and the fringe of black hair brushed low over the forehead. All the pictures of those 10 days in court crowded back into his mind, unbidden and very vivid. "This is all rubbish and nerves," he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy from his chair. "I shall finish my packing and go to bed. I'm overwrought, overtired. No doubt at this rate I shall hear steps and things all night." But his face was deadly white all the same. He snatched up his field glasses and walked across to his bedroom. And the instant he crossed the threshold and stood within the room, something turned cold in his heart, and he felt that every hair stood on end. The kit bag lay close in front of him, several foot nearer to the door than he had left it. And just over its crumpled top, he saw a head and face slowly sinking down out of sight, as though someone was crouching behind it to hide. And at the same moment, a sound like a long-drawn sigh was distinctly audible in the air about him. Such a wave of terror came over him that for some seconds he could do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back and legs, and he was conscious of a foolish, almost a hysterical impulse to scream aloud. That sigh seemed in his very ear, and the air still quivered with it. It was unmistakably a human sigh. "Who's there?" he said at length. But finally, he meant to speak with loud decision, but the voice came out instead in a hushed whisper. He had partly lost the control of his tongue and lips. He stepped forward so that he could see all round and over the kit bag. Of course, there was nothing there. Nothing but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where he had fallen over, being only 3 parts full. And then he saw for the first time that round the inside, some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded bloodstain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as if they'd been burnt. At the same moment, the kit bag gave a faint but unmistakable lurch forward towards the door. Johnson collapsed backwards, searching with his hand for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent his falling and to shut with a resounding bang. At the same moment, the swinging of his left arm accidentally touched the electric switch, and the light in the room went out. He groped furiously for the little brass knob to turn the light on again, but the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it to swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. And in those few moments of bewilderment and terror, 2 things happened that sent him beyond recall over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor in jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. In his efforts to find the brass button on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers. But even then, in those frenzied moments of alarm, he had time to realize that he dreaded the return of light, and that it might be better for him to stay hidden in the merciful screen of darkness. It was the impulse of but a moment, however, and that before he'd had time to act upon it, he yielded automatically to the original desire, and the room was again flooded with light. But the instinct had been right. It would have been better for him to have stayed in the shelter of the kind darkness. For there, close before him, bending over the half-packed kit bag, clear as life in the merciless glare of the electric light, stood the figure of John Turk, the murderer. Not 3 feet from him the man stood, the fringe of black hair marked plainly against the forehead, the whole horrible presentiment of the scoundrel, as vivid as he had seen him day after day at the Old Bailey when he had stood there in the dock, cynical and callous, under the very shadow of the gallows. In a flash, Johnson realized what it meant. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how the victim's body had been stuffed into a canvas bag for burial, the ghastly dismembered fragments forced with lime into this very bag, and the bag itself produced as evidence. It all came back to him clear as day. Very softly and stealthily, his hand groped behind him for the handle of the door, but before he could actually turn it, the very thing he dreaded most of all came about, and John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him. At the same moment, that heavy sigh passed through the air of the room, formulating itself somehow into words. "It's my bag, and I want it back." Johnson clawed the door open, and then falling upon the floor of the landing, he heard his own head smack the floor soundly. Through the sharp pain, he saw the looming figure of John Turk approaching. A great clamor woke him up. He recognized Mrs. Monk's voice, loud and voluble. "What, you ain't been to bed, sir? Are you ill, or has anything happened? Oh, and there's an urgent gentleman to see you, though it ain't yet 7 o'clock. And, who is it?" he stammered. "It's someone from Mr. Wilbraham's, and he says he ought to see you quick before you go abroad. So I told him..." "Show him up, please, at once," said Johnson, whose head was whirling, and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. Mr. Wilbraham's man came in with many apologies and explained briefly and quickly that an absurd mistake had been made and that the wrong kit bag had been sent over the night before. Henry somehow got hold of the one that came over from the courtroom, and Mr. Wilbraham only discovered it when he saw his own lying in his room and asked why it had not gone to you, he remarked. "Oh," said Johnson, "and he must have brought with you the one from the murder case, sir, instead, I'm afraid," the man continued, without the ghost of an expression on his face. "The one John Turk packed the dead body in. Mr. Wilbraham's awful upset about it, sir, and he told me to come over first thing this morning with the right one as you're leaving by boat." He pointed to a clean-looking kit bag on the floor, which he had just brought. "And I was to bring the other one back, sir," he added casually. For some minutes, Johnson could not find his voice. At last, he pointed in the direction of his bedroom. "Perhaps you would kindly unpack it for me? Just empty the things on the floor." The man disappeared into the other room and was gone for 5 minutes. Johnson heard the shifting to and fro of the bag and the rattle of the skates and boots being unpacked. "Thank you, sir," the man said, returning with the bag folded over his arm. "And, can I do anything more to help you, sir?" "What is it?" said Johnson, seeing that he still had something he wished to say. The man shuffled and looked mysterious. "Beg pardon, sir, but knowing your interest in the Turk case, I thought maybe you'd like to know what's happened." "Yes?" "John Turk killed himself last night, immediately on getting his release, and he left a note saying he'd be much obliged if they'd have put him away, same as the woman he murdered, in the old kit bag." "What time did he do it?" asked Johnson. 10 o'clock last night, sir, the warder says. Thank you.